welcome to Village College session on translation and the Bible. I'm excited to hear this myself. Oh yeah, don't forget to turn off your cell phones. We don't need extra voices here, just Nancy and her presentation. So Nancy Heisey is fairly new here, but she's already dived into a lot of things, and she does a lot of tech support, and she's a historian. So I'll let her give her more full introduction.
Okay, let me begin just checking how the mic is. Is this working? Sounds good? Okay, great. Thanks, Joan. So Joan noted right away that I call this translation and the Bible, not translation of the Bible, and that's deliberate. Although I'm going to talk a lot about translation of the Bible, but I'd like us to think not just about that particular document, but also some of the issues, the questions, controversies. Translation itself is a whole field. It's a huge field of study, and we will barely scratch the surface on some of those issues. I want to start by sort of naming this as an homage to the woman that's pictured there, Miss Faye Edgerton. She's probably on that photograph about the age I am now, and she was a woman I knew as a little girl who was a translator of the Navajo Bible, one of a group of people working on the translation of the Navajo Bible. And I met her as she would come to teach Navajo among the community where I lived to Anglos, as white people in that community were referred to. And I just thought she was the coolest person. And I really sometimes think that it's her influence that kind of took me in the direction that I ended up studying. I have been hanging around Bible translators my whole life. And certainly she would have been the first and a woman of note in a way that I wasn't used to seeing women function in that way in my own community. And so she was very influential in my life. I want to start out by identifying that I am not a translator in terms of the training that any official translator needs to be. My only real translation project was working with Dr. Robert Wright at Temple University when the New English translation of the Septuagint was being done, and he was handling the translation of the Psalms of Solomon, which is a Second Temple piece of writing, fairly obscure, and I might do a class on Second Temple literature sometime later where we could talk about that. But anyway, and that was a case where we had an official translator and we were part of the translation team. And that whole process is something I want to discuss later in our time together. So this is kind of an outline of what I'm going to try to do, starting with some ancient history, and then looking specifically at the Dead Sea Scrolls and the impact that they've had. Then I want to talk about the Bible in Spanish. This is a whole new area of interest for me that I sort of came upon when it suddenly occurred to me that I've spent a lot of time thinking about the English Bible, but the way the Bible has entered into other language patterns is something that is virtually unknown in the English-speaking world. So I tried to do some research on that. I want to talk about translation and mission. That's often where some of the rub comes in. And then in the last session, we'll try to talk about just translation as a process and all the questions that surround it. And I thought it might be helpful to identify, first of all, that when I say translation, I'm talking about written text to written text. In the field, if you are a translator, that's what you're doing. If you are an interpreter, you are trained for oral presentation from one language to another. So say you work at the United Nations or wherever you might work, in an oral kind of fashion. That's where the words are coming in through the headset and you're rendering them in another language. I tried to do that once and I about went crazy. I was translating someone speaking in French into English and I said, I'd have to go to school to learn how to do this. So we're going to talk about translation, although interpretation sometimes comes into the process. And I thought it would be interesting because I'm guessing that there are a lot of people here who would consider yourselves at least somewhat competent in more than one language. And this, I can't see the hands of people that are online, but for those who are in the room, how many of you have actually worked in another language at least enough that you feel like you know the process of going back and forth? Okay, good, because I think you can bring your own insights into this just based on work that you have done. So that's what we're going to try to do. And I'm sure this is true for everybody who presents at Village College. It's kind of a question of who knows what. And for some of you, this may be stuff you've heard 100 times. For others, it may be completely strange. I'm going to try to stop at least once or twice in the middle so that if I've completely lost you, you can ask me about what I'm talking about. And also that would be times when you could share experiences or ideas that you have about translation. So I want to start by talking about, I should say one other thing. My whole world, because it's been based around the ancient Mediterranean, really focuses on that piece of history, and I am completely unable to comment intelligently on the languages of India or what has gone on in China. And so that's just a big lack in my understanding. There's been some really interesting new publication on Bible translation in Chinese, which I'd love to get into someday, but I'm focusing primarily on the worlds that kind of emerged out of the ancient Mediterranean. And so just to put that there. But I think one of the important things to begin with when you talk about translation as word or sentence or thought transcription from one language to another is, when did that become important and why? And in the ancient world, there were a variety of ways that people communicated across language barriers. We have this interesting account in Herodotus who describes the silent barter that was reported to him. And he's not the only ancient thinker who talked about silent barter, and some people actually observed it. In this case, he's saying, someone told me that this is what happened. And so basically, this is something that happened in Africa where the Carthaginians, so they would be the coastal people, are going inland and they are trading for gold. And that is a trade, if you look at histories of West Africa, that was a really significant trade among people in the kingdoms along the west coast of Africa, where gold was valuable to the Mediterraneans and salt was valuable to the people in West Africa. So we know that from other forms of research in terms of African history. But here, this is a Greek hearing a report, and this is what he says. So the Carthaginians come and they unload their cargo, they put down their gold in exchange for the cargoes, and they withdraw. And then the other people bring it in. The Carthaginians disembark, they have a look. If it seems like it's the right amount, they take it and go away. But if it is not equal in value, no explanation about how they figure that out. But if it isn't equal in value, they go back on their boats and wait, and the locals come back, lay down more gold until such point as the Carthaginians agree. Neither party is unjust. The Carthaginians do not take hold of the gold until it is equal in value to their cargoes, nor do the locals take hold of the cargoes until the Carthaginians take the gold. It's a very interesting account. It's probably a little rose-colored glasses. We don't know that. But I want to just mention a couple of questions that come up in terms of this account of pre or non-literate exchange of information. Of course, one of the things people ask is this historical? What's the historicity of this account? And there's a lot of people who have discussed this and questioned it. All the ancient historians, whether they're Romans or Greeks or Jewish like Josephus, will have people that will immediately critique their historical accounts. At the same time, there are actually clear indications that these people just weren't making things up. And so looking for the evidence is important. But what I think is just as interesting as the historical question is, what is it that moves people to want to communicate across language difference? And that's really where the translation question comes in. So if you look at Herodotus's account, it's clearly a market issue. It's an economic question. It's a need on two sides where there's a market. Another reason, and some people would suggest that Herodotus is sort of covering up the conquest part of this story. Is there an effort on the part of the Carthaginians to establish territorial control? And of course, that has always been a place where different groups of people encounter each other and communicate or fail to communicate. Some communication across languages in the very ancient world had to do with proclamation. And we're going to look at an example of that. Someone who is in a place of power or authority is trying to say, I am very powerful and I am full of victory. And the poem Ozymandias, which we probably all studied somewhere in school, is an example of someone, a modern writer, looking at that kind of communication. Curiosity. Clearly, human beings have always been curious about difference and tried to understand at least a little bit about people who aren't like them. That was a big part of what Herodotus was doing. People were interested in curious stuff. And so the communications across the question of curiosity come up. And sometimes communication, and this is where I think translation becomes relevant, is when people have the desire to share something with somebody who doesn't speak the same language or doesn't use the same language as they do. So the Herodotus account probably meets at least the first two of those criteria. But we're going to see how the translation, as it becomes practiced in a place where as it becomes practiced in relationship to the Bible, has to do perhaps more with the latter three of these: proclamation, curiosity, and desire to share. So this is the Merneptah stela. It's pretty accurately dated to 1208. It was uncovered in Egypt in, let me get the date on that, 1896 by a British archaeologist. Has anybody seen this? It's in the Egypt Museum. It's in the Cairo Museum in Egypt. Well, I'll tell you that if you show up there looking like a Westerner, the museum guide is going to take you right to this place, because they think that all the Westerners come there to see this document. And the reason that they assume that is because this is a very monumental, it's probably up to the ceiling of this room, is the first known reference that includes the word Israel. So because it's dated in 1208, it gives us a pinpoint in historical record that is external to anything that you could find in the biblical materials, that there was somebody, a people. The scholars go all over the place in terms of just what is being referred to. But when I walked into the museum, the guide picked me right up and took me right to this thing and pointed it out. So I'm going to show you the hieroglyph that has been read as Israel. And I can't read hieroglyphic. By the way, hieroglyphic literally is holy writing. That's what the word means in Greek. And so the writing in the monuments, just to go back to, let me go back up, where's page up? Here we go. The writing in hieroglyphic is both sort of royal proclamation. Merneptah was the pharaoh, but it is also the language of the priestly class. And so the links between religious identity, as modern people would call it, and political or imperial or whatever other name you want to give it, force, are very closely tied. And the ability to write in ancient Egypt was handled by the priestly class. So here we have this hieroglyph referring to Israel, and the specific, there's a bit of diversity in terms of the translation, but the text as it is usually translated is, I defeated Israel, she is no more. And that's really kind of interesting and ironic, because that period of history is about the time when we start seeing evidence of some kind of new community rising in the hill country of Judea. Now, I'm not going to get into all of that historical stuff. I mean, we maybe can talk about it in the Q&A. That's a very disputed historical set of circumstances, exactly what was happening when, but it's clear that there's some kind of a link between this proclamation that the Pharaoh had destroyed something and what we actually see happening in the hill country of Judea. So that is the Merneptah Stela, and it was able to be deciphered because of another really important discovery. And that was the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which is still in the British Museum, to the dissatisfaction of the Egyptians. We could go into another whole discussion about who controls the material. And I'm sure that you all know about the Rosetta Stone. It is, in fact, and this one was discovered by Napoleon's people in 1790, let me get it right here, 1798, I believe. But this is dated 196 BCE. So it's much more recent than Merneptah, but this was the discovery that allowed Westerners to begin to decipher hieroglyphic. There were not cues or clues that people could use before that time from a modern and a Western point of view. And the Rosetta Stone is basically written in 3 languages. The hieroglyphs are at the top, and then in the middle, we have Demotic Egyptian. It's a script using the ancient Egyptian language, so it would be like a transliteration of the hieroglyphs, and then in the bottom, you have the Greek. And this particular document was put up at a temple by the priests, the Egyptian priests, who were trying to honor the Ptolemy, the Hellenistic ruler. This is all part of the story of Alexander the Great's conquests and how the Hellenistic culture begins to permeate much of the Mediterranean world. And so the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt were Greek-speaking, and for folks of a certain level of education and economic status, Greek became the way they understood, the way you get ahead. You study Greek, you read Homer, and you become cosmopolitan. Now, one of the things I think is important to note is that Hellenization did not erase the cultures of the places where it went. Hellenization actually was sort of blended into Egyptian or or Asia Minor, which we would call modern Turkey, Palestine, that area, even as far east as Babylon, you would have mixing of cultures. And that's certainly the case in Egypt. But I want you to see now just a little section from the Rosetta Stone. This is a piece of the text, and essentially what we see is Egyptians, the priestly caste, trying to say good things about their Greek rulers. And so it's basically saying this is something for the shrine of the god. And remember that the god and the king were very much intertwined in identity. This decree shall be inscribed upon a stela of hard stone in the writing of the word. They explain what we're doing here. The writing of the words of the gods, that's hieroglyphic, and the writing of the books, that's demotic, and the writing of Haunabui, that's an Egyptian term for the Greeks. And it shall be set up in the sanctuaries of the temples near the statue of Horus, the king of the south, and north Ptolemy, ever living beloved of Ptah, the Egyptian god. By the way, that's who Merneptah was also named after. The God who maketh himself manifest, whose deeds are beautiful. Okay, so this is like political schmoozing here. But it's basically saying we're going to take our Egyptian way and we're going to use it to honor the Ptolemy. There's also some really interesting back history here about northern Egypt and southern Egypt and how the Egyptian empire came together in a much, much earlier conflict between the north and the south. I couldn't begin to address that intelligently, but what you see here, I think, is a really fantastic illustration of proclamation and some curiosity, right? How are we going to make sure that we all are on board with our Ptolemies? They're running things, they're collecting the taxes. They must be beloved of Horus, the Egyptian god, and so forth, or of Ptah, and so forth. So the Rosetta Stone was a really critical discovery for modern Western people to try to come to terms with what you could find in the incredibly complex ancient history of Egypt. Okay, I'm going to just stop for a minute now and see if I'm going too fast. How are we doing? Okay, all right, so now I want to talk about Jews in Egypt, because I think it's fair to say that translation as we know it is a gift to the human race from Jews in Egypt. And the whole question of how that happened and why, we'll try to get into that both this week and next week. I want to start with the prologue to a writing by a learned scholar from Jerusalem. His name was Ben Sira. And we have it in Greek. After the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, we said, well, yes, it was in Hebrew too, or at least Hebrew Aramaic, but it was translated in Egypt by Ben Sira's grandson. And he was translating it for his Jewish colleagues who weren't able to access the Hebrew writing. This is what he says in the prologue. You are invited to read this attentively and with an open mind, and to exhibit a spirit of understanding, forgiveness when, despite the most diligent efforts in translation, I may seem to have rendered some passages inadequately. Translators always have to cover their butts, because somebody's going to argue. For words originally expressed in Hebrew do not have the same sense when translated into another language. Not only this present book, but even the law itself, the prophets, and the rest of the books differ quite a bit when they are read in the original. We're going to get to the Septuagint in just a bit. But this is certainly after the Torah would have been translated into Greek, and we'll talk about that. And then he goes on to date it so we can locate it in 132 BCE. In the 38th year of the reign of King Abraxas I, he would have been a Ptolemy, I arrived in Egypt and set up my residence there. I discovered that the book, my grandfather's book, has great educational value. So during this time period, I have applied my skill toward the completion of this book for the benefit of those living abroad who wish to acquire learning and are disposed to live their lives according to the law, according to the Torah. So the grandson essentially lays out a translation theory and explains that it's not straightforward. You have to think about it. There are some things that don't translate too easily into another language. But what he's saying here, and this is, I think, the point 5 on those 5 things that I listed, I want to share this. This is really important information, and it's a way for you all, the Jews of Egypt, who don't know Hebrew, to have, it's a kind of commentary on law. Now, Ben Sira is really largely a wisdom document. It's reminiscent of some of the literature in Proverbs, for example. Nevertheless, it has to do with proper practice and honor of the God of Israel and how that gets carried out in a new place. So we kind of have this cross-cultural thing going on, both in terms of language and in terms of practice. So let's then talk about the translation of the Torah from Hebrew to Greek. So we're actually taking a step backward historically, because we would probably date that to the 3rd century BCE, and this is like the 2nd century BCE. We don't have we can't pin it down to a specific date, but it would have happened somewhat earlier. So the translation of the Torah from Hebrew to Greek is really a remarkable cultural moment in history of the world. We've talked about the Hellenistic, in a way, hegemony is the word. In another way, maybe not so much, but the Hellenism was the ruling worldview of the ancient Mediterranean, starting from the 300s when Alexander's troops marched into Egypt and all the way to the Indus River. There are places even in Pakistan today that are still named after Alexander the Great. So, I mean, he really did get there. But the question of the translation of the Torah from Hebrew to Greek is recounted in a writing called the Letter of Aristeas. And we're going to look at just a brief section of that letter. You can read the whole thing if you're interested. It's not that long, and you can go and type it in, find it on the internet, read the whole thing. But the way Aristeas tells us what happened is as much an explanation of what the Jewish community wanted other people to think about as of what was probably really the need for the Greek. So in the letter of Aristeas, we see this, in a way, it's kind of like Herodotus. This was an amazing, harmonious process. The librarian of Alexandria wrote to the chief, the leader of the temple in Jerusalem, and said, send us your best translators. We want to have a complete record of all the literature of the world in our great library, including your texts. So these 70 or 72, I'll talk a little bit about that, came, translated, were greeted, everything went beautifully, everybody was respectful, they loved each other. But at the same time, the letter is pretty clear that the Jewish translators carefully observed the law during that whole process. So you basically see an expression of mutual respect and cultural understanding as the letter describes it. Now, we do not have records of any resistance to this translation in the Jewish community in Egypt. The question of whether translation is a good idea kind of came up at a couple of other places later, but in contrast to the way translation has been handled in Christian communities let's say, in Europe, where people were killing each other for translating into another language, this is remarkable in that it seemed to be a relatively happy process. So just a note about the word Septuagint, which is the way the document is usually referred to, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that all might include. That's the Latin for 70. And in the record of the letter of Aristeas, it says that 70 translators were sent, but it says 6 from each tribe, which makes 72. And most people would think that that may be because when Moses was trying to figure out how to rule the people in the wilderness, he appointed 70 elders. And so the writer wanted to get both of those numbers in there. So we don't need to linger over that. It's not a historical datum. It's just a reason to explain why we call it the 70 when it might also be 72 translators. When we talk about the Septuagint, in general, we're going to, and I'll talk more about this next week, we're referring to a lot of translation of Jewish literature from Hebrew or Aramaic into Greek. But in the letter of Aristeas, we're basically talking about Torah, the first translation that was done in the first 5, from the first 5 scrolls. So here's just a section from the letter of Aristeas. This is just a description of one day while the translators were in Alexandria. In the early morning, the Jerusalem scholars appeared daily at the king's court, and after saluting the king, they went back to their own place. And as is the custom of all the Jews, they washed their hands in the sea and prayed to God, and then devoted themselves to reading and translating the particular passage upon which they were engaged. They explained to their Egyptian hosts that they washed their hands as a token that they had done no evil, since in their noble and holy way they regard everything as a symbol of righteousness and truth. As I have already said, they met together daily in the place, which was delightful for its quiet and its brightness. Modern scholars like, boy, we wish they'd let us work like that, and applied themselves to their task. And it so chanced that the work of translation was completed in 72 days, just as if this had been arranged of set purpose. Now that's the one thing that everybody says that couldn't possibly have happened. You couldn't have done that in 72 days. But the idea of a workplace and a place where people could practice the proper protocols of the faith before you sit down to your work, it does sound like an amazing process. And certainly the translation of the Torah as we have it in the Greek texts, the oldest Greek text, is pretty remarkable. I'm going to talk more about the question that Ben Sira's grandson raised about what happens when you can't just make a word-for-word transition. We'll talk about that. But the overall picture presented in the letter of Aristeas, while it's probably fictional as to the actual events, does represent the way the Jewish community presented to everybody what they had done and why, and the value of it, and how well it went. So that's the letter that people read to think about the translation. Now, let's talk about whether people knew about this account and what they thought of it. We know that Josephus was aware that the letter of Aristeas had been written. And of course, Josephus wrote in Greek. Once he had gone off to the Romans and was trying to convince them that he was a good guy. But I think it's more intriguing that Philo, who lived in Alexandria, the great Jewish philosopher, he talked about this letter, and now he's describing the letter about a century and a half later, when he says they get together, the Jewish community gets together once a year to celebrate the translation, which is a remarkable observation. And then he adds to, or maybe we should say enhances, the account, because he says that the translators were under inspiration. I don't know if this is the first time that inspiration gets applied to Bible translation, but I think it is. And he says they were inspired and the same word for word as though dictated to each by an invisible prompter. Now, if you've been around anybody that holds to plenary inspiration of scripture in the modern world, this is the way they would say all Bible translation has happened. And it's really intriguing that Philo seemed to need to be a little more defensive or supportive of the translation by claiming that level of dictation for the translation. We don't know whether Philo knew much Hebrew. It seems that he probably didn't, but in any case, that's always a question for the Egyptian community going on up into the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, because the Jewish community in Alexandria was still very prominent in terms of the scholarly life of the Jewish community. Okay, so let's just think a little bit about some of the things that we can see. There's a modern scholarly society called Septuagint and Cognate Studies, and it's a huge scholarly field of its own, and people have conferences and write papers. It's an international society. One of the things that scholars are really interested in when they look at the translations is the discussion of whether the translators were more content focused or theologically motivated. And that's an interesting question in terms of, are you trying to stay as close to the content as you find it? This is another one of those theory questions for translators. Or are you trying to make sure that the text says what you think it should say? And that's a valid question. I want to just take a bit of time to think specifically about the way the translators handled the divine name. But before I do that, just note that the translators in the Septuagint did make one very interesting choice. They took a remote Greek word, hagios, to translate the word for holy instead of the Greek term hieros. And that's the word that you have in hieroglyphic. So they were trying to signal something about a different kind of holiness in the work that they were doing. They didn't leave us any notes, but it's just noteworthy that was one change that they made. Hagios, if you've ever been to the Hagia Sophia, or you've been where people do the Tris Hagion in a liturgy, that's the holy, holy, holy phrase in Greek. The Septuagint almost always translates the Hebrew name for God, the Tetragrammaton, the 4-letter unpronounceable name, as Kurios, which is Lord. Now, Kurios, that is the word when you say the Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, that's the word we're using. That can mean Lord, it can mean Sir, it can mean Master. It has a variety of translations, but in the Septuagintal text, it is used for the name of God. And this is probably because we know by that time, readers of scripture in Hebrew were pronouncing the Hebrew word Adonai, which is Lord or my Lord, when they came across the Tetragrammaton in the text. And so the translators took that into account. But what we also recognize is that the Greek translation lost the understanding of the significance of the divine name. And I'm going to show you that when we get to the Targums, which is another kind of translation from the ancient period, they worked harder at that particular transfer. There's another thing that's intriguing about the Septuagint, and that has to do with what they did with Sabbath commands, a very central part of Torah practice. So in Hebrew, the word for seven and the word for Sabbath have the same root. It's the same idea. So if you're reading the Hebrew text, you're going to see that. And so when you're talking about every 7 days you should keep the Sabbath or text like that, you're going to be hearing in Hebrew repeated sounds. And the Greek translators actually didn't quite know what to do with that, so they actually did a transliteration, sabbata. If you study Greek, that's the word that you will use. But interestingly, in Greek, they made it a plural. So, I mean, there is a singular form of this word, but mostly the translation talked about sabbata as a plural. And sometimes, instead of using that, they used a Greek word which meant rest. I'm not going to bore you with the Greek word because it's nothing you've probably ever heard. But so in the translation, they did both of those things. They didn't say why, but they clearly were at one level, they're trying to keep the seven idea in there somehow. And at another level, they were trying to say, but this means rest. There's a really interesting place in Leviticus where we see them sort of struggling with these two ideas. So the Hebrew is Shabbat Shabbaton, a Sabbath of rest, or a Sabbath of sevens. And that would fit into all of the teachings also about the sabbatical year and the Jubilee and so on. So the Greek translated this a Sabbath of rest. That's literally how you do it. But you don't get the repeated sound in the Greek. And there was another interesting little grammatical thing that either the translators didn't know or they decided to let lie. And that is when you have a repeated phrase like this in Hebrew, it's a superlative. So literally in Hebrew, it's meant to be the most restful of all rests. And even a very paltry Hebrew student like me learned that in Hebrew, that when you have that kind of repeated form, it's like emphatic. And the translators didn't do that. So they call it the Sabbath of rest, and the Hebrew was meant to be the absolute or most amazing day of rest.
I think it refers to Yom Kippur.
In Leviticus, yes, thank you for that. And that would fit, right, with the idea of Yom Kippur and what it's for. And so that emphatic would really matter in that. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, so at the same time, I mean, I'm showing some of the translational issues you can see here. At the same time, I think there's pretty widespread understanding that the Torah portions in the early Greek were done extremely well. The idea that there was a lot of like content switching or anything like that is not borne out in the field of textual studies.
Could you say more about that? I didn't understand what you just said.
Well, if you go back to the question of is your translation content focused or is it theologically motivated? And there's always a concern when you're dealing with holy writing that the translators might miss something or change something to make a theological point.
Their own, not the Hebrew.
Their own as they understood it in their own time and place. Yeah. So the question of how much do translators try to render as best as they can what they know the text is saying as best as they can, and how much do they say, well, I think they meant this, or now we know this, and therefore we're going to put it this way. That's the point I'm trying to make. And I think the consensus is that the Torah portions are very overall in close keeping with the intentions of the Hebrew manuscripts. Now, we're going to see that has to do with a set of Hebrew manuscripts that are 1,000 years later than all this writing when we get to the Dead Sea Scrolls next week, but we'll go there then. Okay, so that anybody who's ever done any translating at all knows that this is one of the questions you deal with. You might not have a theological basis, but you might have something that you just think really matters, and you just want to make sure it gets in the text, and you might make, okay, I'll tell you, this is an interpretation story, but one time I was in Burkina Faso, and I was translating a Burkinabe leader into English for a visitor, and he was saying things that I found a little embarrassing, and I was so tempted to fix them as I translated. That's the issue I'm talking about. Okay, let's talk then about the Targums, because here we have another set of translations and commentaries. The Targums are in Aramaic. And Aramaic was actually the lingua franca of much of the ancient world until Alexander the Great, coming out of Babylon. In fact, the Hebrew script that I learned and that most of us probably read is actually Aramaic script. The ancient Hebrew alphabet was quite different. The Targums are later. They're dated to the 2nd century CE, although they include material that most people agree is much older. But the manuscripts as we know them are probably dated to that time. And there are 5 Targums on the Pentateuch or the Torah. One of them that has been particularly influential, originating in Palestine and then edited in Babylon, the Targum Onkelos, as one scholar put it, is literal translations of the Hebrew text with a great deal of additional and sometimes highly creative material. Or you could say text and commentary, which in a way is repeating what is already also going on in the Mishnah as that develops in the rabbinic community in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. But what we see here is that there's a need to render the text into Aramaic. Now, I will tell you that Aramaic, I took a course in Aramaic, and I really struggled to decipher the differences between Hebrew and Aramaic. My professor could do it, but I would say, I don't see this. And the lexicons that, back in the day when we used books, the lexicons always included Hebrew and Aramaic together. They are cognate languages. It's not like Greek, which is a completely different linguistic form. The Aramaic is Semitic, the Greek is Indo-European, and all that sort of stuff. Nevertheless, there are significant things that need to be noted in the Targums. And I want to bring up one interesting one in relationship to the divine name. So here we have a text from Exodus, and I'm using an English translation of the Masoretic text, which we'll talk more about next week. But the Masoretic text is a Hebrew manuscript upon which almost all Bible translations were based right on into the end of the 20th century, in any language, whether to English or French or German or Chinese or whatever. So here we have the promise, I will bring you into the land which I swore to give you to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession, I the Lord. That would be the divine name there. In Targum Onkelos, we have this, and I will bring you into the land which I swore with my memrah to give it to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. That addition, that memrah, takes the place of the word I in the Masoretic text. And the memrah is essentially the Aramaic verb for speaking. It's the Aramaic word for the word. And so essentially what you see is that Targum Onkelos wants to identify that this I is the divine name. Because I didn't check the Aramaic, I'm not sure what they did with Lord at the end there, but the addition of this word is an example of commentary, if you like, or clarification, if you like, or identification of the way the rabbis who did this work were trying to do something with the divine name that I think did not happen in the Septuagintal translation. So the Targums are studied, people who do textual studies pay a lot of attention to the Targums, in particular because Targum Onkelos, some people think, is related to a later Greek translation of the Torah that was done in Egypt about the same time. And so you have all these different textual intersections that people are looking at. I am not an expert on Targums. I've read a little bit in the Targums, but I think the idea that was becoming very prominent among Jewish communities at that time, that you always could comment on the text. You read it and you comment on it, is something that we see represented in this translation example. Okay, that's what I have for today. So maybe we can have the lights, and then if you have questions or clarifications, I'll try to respond. Chava?
So,
Oh,
yeah, Mike.
Mike, we've got 2 mics, and there's Joan's got one right there.
Yes, I think it's on. First of all, I mean, this actually, I started to think about when you, at the beginning of this section, and I was thinking about, I was interested that there was a word that is translated in Greek, translated as translation in your earliest texts. When did the Greeks start to think about something called translation? Do you know anything about the history of that term? And then I tried to think about the Hebrew, and I realized Targum, the word Targum is Aramaic, not Hebrew. And I couldn't think of any Hebrew word not based on that Aramaic that means translation. So it's obviously a later thing in Hebrew literature than it is in the Greek, but I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question is, I'm going to repeat because sometimes people can't hear it over the mic, over the YouTube. The question of when the Greeks talked about translation as translation is a really interesting one. And I think that where translation really became an issue in Greek was with the rise of the Roman Empire. There you would have had mostly translation of imperial documentation and so forth. In the early days of the empire, so we're talking like 1st century CE, we actually know that the Romans really wanted all their imperial people to speak Greek. It was the language of the learned. And so I have not tracked that discussion, but I think that's where translation of Greek took on importance in the pagan world, or the broader.
Although the Ben Sira text is earlier than that.
Yes, but what I was trying to say was the idea of translating texts started with Jews.
Yeah. Right.
That's the point.
There was already a word in Greek for it, though, which Ben Sira's grandson used.
You know, I'm going to go look at the Greek. I'll tell you what it is.
Never mind.
I don't have the Greek
It's not
text
a
in
big
front.
deal.
No, you're right. He understood that translation was a thing, and I will figure out what that word is.
Yeah, and the other thing I just want to say off the cuff here is that Hebrew and Aramaic to me seem very different. That they're clearly related, like say Italian and Spanish.
Right.
But you give me a text of ancient Hebrew and I can read it reasonably fluently. You give me a text of Aramaic and I struggle and need to look things up and can't make head or tail of it. So they are different languages.
Yes, I know that, but when we were looking at Dead Sea Scrolls in my class and trying to figure out whether the text was in Hebrew or in Aramaic, it wasn't that easy.
Mm-hmm.
So,
sure.
Good point. Thank you. Yes, Rick?
Just, are there any instances in this era of Hebrew and Aramaic, as there are in Homer, where a word was completely made up? I think it's called hypox.
A hapax. Well, hapax is a word that we only have one example of.
Homer would make up words.
Well, Greeks were great at that. I mean, Greek is very much what I would call a Lego language, where you can stick two things together and make something new with it. So made up words, we certainly find those in Greek text. Some people think that Paul made up some of the words that he used in his writings in the New Testament. I'm not, because ancient Hebrew, as we know it, has a fairly limited vocabulary. I don't think we have enough evidence to know whether those were made up words or not. But we certainly see that happening in Greek. There's a question back there. Okay, I don't know who's personing the mics. Dallas, and then maybe over to you.
Was Aramaic related to the Hebrew language?
Yes, they are cognate languages. They use the same alphabet and the same grammatical structures. So you can learn vocabulary that goes back and forth between them. Yes.
Nancy, I just wanted to ask about the term,
Let's get the mic. Yeah. Yes, I will do that. Thank you. Which number do you have, Charlie? Okay, son. Okay.
I wanted to ask about the term pagan that I kept seeing, not frequently, but several times. And then you just mentioned the word pagan. Was that actually in the text that they were translating?
Pagan is a Latin term that people who study the ancient Mediterranean used to describe everybody who wasn't Jewish. In other words, it was just all the people and all of their practices. It has come to have a different meaning, a different connotation in terms of contemporary usage, but pagan was just the people of the Mediterranean world. So, except for Jews. Polytheists and so on, yeah. Okay, anyone else?
Well, I've got one. This may seem very basic, but I'm just struggling a bit between the words Torah, Septuagint, and Old Testament.
Okay. No, that's very important. So when I say Torah, in this instance, I am talking about the first 5 scrolls, which in Greek are called Pentateuch. Okay, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Now, Torah, as Chavor, anyone can tell you, also refers to the broader instructions of the law, right, as they are found in the Jewish writings. When we say Septuagint, and I'm going to come back to this next week, we're starting with that Torah translation, but it also gets applied then to other scriptures that were also translated into Greek. First of all, the prophets, and then some additional writings. So Septuagint is a very loose term. In this particular presentation, I was specifically speaking of the first 5 scrolls. Old Testament covers the 39 writings as they're counted up in the Protestant canon, or the 22 writings, as Josephus named them, that are part of the Tanakh, which is the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. So there's a lot of technical lingo here, and it's a little hard to keep straight. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I think that helps.
It's a little complicated, and of course, a lot of this has to do with the fact that, the entire Bible is really a Jewish document, and 75% of it was written by Jews before Jesus, right? So how do we talk about all of that? It is the Tanakh, or the Bible, in the Jewish community. Christians have called New Testament, Old Testament, and so on. So that's another reason why we get a little linguistically confused. Anyone else? We're almost out of time. One more question or no? Okay. See you next week.